everyone. Welcome to Ones and Tooze. You can all hear me okay? Thank you. I'm Claudia Tatey. I'm the producer of Ones and Tooze. We're really excited to be here tonight. I'm normally the one pressing record on the other end of Adam and Cam's microphones, not using one myself, so bear with me here. Just wanted to thank you all for coming tonight. This is actually our second time at Caveat. I stood on the stage 2 years ago, almost exactly, and introduced Adam and Cam for their first ever live show. We were celebrating our 1-year anniversary that night, and now we are back celebrating 3 years of the podcast. We have published over 150 episodes, have had millions of downloads. This is our 6th live show. That's all an incredible feat. The real feat, though, is that we managed to find a time every week in Adam's schedule to record. He's a really busy guy, I'm sure you can imagine. Literally just got off a flight from Scotland hours ago to be here. But it really is a highlight of my week every week, getting to sit in on their discussions and then listen to it over and over and over again as I edit it. But we love to share those more behind-the-scenes moments with you all at these live shows. So really thank you again for coming. Thank you, Caveat, for having us back. Thank you, Cam, for coming all the way from Berlin, and Adam for making his flight this morning. Thanks, everyone at FP who makes the podcast possible. And yeah, that's it. Without further ado, let's introduce the hosts of Ones and Tooze, Cameron Embody and Adam Tooze.
Setup. This works.
And let's hear it for Claudie, whose birthday it is this evening.
Exactly. I was gonna say
we didn't know that. She didn't mention it.
No, she did all the thanks to everyone, but yeah, we should call out Claudia, not only for the intro, not only for being on the podcast every week, but yeah, it's her birthday. Yeah, happy birthday, Claudia. Yeah, we're obviously really happy to be here. When we scheduled this, we kind of joked that it was going to be our, late night, after hours Ones and Tooze. It's 9:30 p.m. here in New York, later than we've done our other live shows, later than we normally record. This might in fact be a little looser, a little loopier than our other shows. Not least because, literally Adam just got off a plane, more or less directly came here from Scotland. That almost sounds like a parody of Adam's life, but it is reality. We should do that every time, I think, now. I think you should, I don't know, we should get you a helicopter. You should chopper in to our live shows in general. But otherwise, I guess we should just kind of dive in. We normally talk about a handful of subjects every week. We throw in a data point. But I guess you all know that. Otherwise, I don't know why you're here if you have never heard the podcast. We thought we'd return to a few subjects that we've kind of talked about in the past. Some of them repeatedly, some of them we talked about in private. But we thought we'd share them again with you all today. Those topics, just so you all have a preview, one will be climate and climate activism. One will be John Maynard Keynes, one of Adam's intellectual heroes. Fair to say hero? I think hero. And then also the UN. Obviously, it's UN week here in New York, it's been a hell of a lot of traffic on the streets. If anyone's ventured out. We thought we'd talk about the UN and specifically the idea of cosmopolitanism, which the UN stands for. So, some things that broadly have to do with economics. We'll see how much. To start off with climate. We talked about climate just a couple weeks ago on the podcast. And it was a long discussion, but we even then got cut off. Like, we had to end the episode. I felt like we were in the middle of the discussion. We were talking about the book that I just wrote. By the way, both of our books are available here. Bookseller came here check them out. They're available here. I guess we'd both be available to sign them if you're interested. But we were talking about this book that I wrote about climate activism and the limits of climate activism, whether climate activism is helping promote progress, and how much of a difference, how much democracy can solve the issue of climate change, whether democracy can solve the issue of climate change. And then we kind of got cut off. And I had a question after we got off the call, which I realized I didn't ask, which is, Adam, whether you are an activist yourself. You care a lot about climate. You talk a lot about climate. You talk a lot about a lot of issues that we talk about on this podcast, about politics and progressive issues and progressive economics. And we all know where you stand. But are you an activist? I actually don't know the answer to that. And why or why not?
Yeah, the question brought me up short in that I'm not sure how I even feel about the question, or trying to decide whether I am or not. And that sent me down a rabbit hole, because I got to wondering why it was that I found it so hard to decide whether I was, an activist. Whether
You're sitting in a therapy session now.
Whether that label is really right. And so I began to wonder whether it had to do with age, not in the sense that I'm too old to be an activist, but in the sense that my sense of what activism is might be epochal. So then I ended up going down the rabbit hole of the etymology of the word activist, which is really interesting, it turns out, because the first uses of the word activist or activism in mid-19th century, and they come from chemistry. It's actually something about elements. Some elements are activists. Some elements exhibit activism in the sense that it's particularly reactive. And then the next set of usages are to do with pragmatic philosophy, i.e. philosophies which say that we only know through action on the world. And then the first use of the first political use of activism is actually during World War I, and it's the folks who were being activists in the name of their neutral countries joining the Central Powers, i.e. Germany, Austria, Ottoman Empire, against the Entente. So in Sweden, the first usage was in modern Sweden as a political term. It's not until the 1920s that activism really begins to be identified with politics at all, and then it's a more general sense almost of state activism, so state interventionism. And it's not until really late in the day that it acquires the specific connotation that it has in modern America today. And that really helped me, because if you'd asked me in the 80s, when I was most politically engaged, I would never have referred to myself as an activist. I would have called myself a militant or a party worker, in the French sense of militant, right? If you're a member of a party, I was a trotter at the time. You went out and did all these things like, sell newspapers on street corners. That wasn't activism, right? That was party work that you did. And I think activism is NGO talk, right? It's the language of politics beyond socialism, beyond Marxism, beyond organized mass parties. And to that extent, folks like myself socialized 10 years before that, politically socialized 10 years before that, on the left, have a slightly angular relationship to it. In the US, it's different because civil rights activism is such an obvious term. And then the new social movements are also activist. Now, I think it just has the connotation of anyone involved in trying to make change. And I would probably have to plead guilty to being part of that cohort. And it would, in my case, involve both, sounding off and having opinions about stuff and talking about it all the time, but also various types of inside, not the sort of people you talk about in the book, so interesting, like Ender Gelände that actually tries to shut coal-fired power stations down, or Fridays for Future. I'll be entertaining Louisa Neubauer at Columbia on Friday. But inside lobby work. So we had this campaign against nonsense output gaps, which was a campaign to name and shame IMF economists who were perpetrating what we thought were analytical crimes in IMF assessments of the state of the Italian economy. And Twitter was our weapon, occasionally also newspapers. And we would just simply point out the absurdity of claiming that the output gap was smaller in Italy than it was in Germany, and we would just work our way through the numbers. So it was a sort of inside It was an activism within the narrow group of expert opinion, but very different from the sort of people that you analyze in your book.
First thing I
More
want
like climate science, if you like, in that way, but in the much more modest domain of economics.
The first thing I want to clarify is whether you, in fact, were selling party newspapers in the 1980s on the streets.
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Absolutely.
I didn't know that.
It's a deeply humbling experience. And
Okay.
I highly recommend it to any upper class
Of which
No,
streets?
it's really
What
streets
town?
of
Where were
Cambridge,
you?
In front of
Cambridge.
in front of my student peers. Yeah.
Oh,
It was quite something. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and but you would describe, or maybe another way, I guess, of asking this question. I mean, does your academic training interfere with thinking of yourself as an activist? I mean, sometimes the skepticism that academia requires methodologically, the kind of methods that academia involves, does that conflict with activism at all?
No, because I'm far too deeply indebted to a sort of pragmatic praxis theory. So no. So engagement drives thought. Serious, intellectually minded engagement drives thinking. Of course, it raises issues of bias and so on, but I take those to be out there in the world anyway. And so the question is really how you navigate within those biases, and a more self-conscious taking of position, in fact, is a clarifying move, because it exposes. It's not quite the same as selling newspapers, but
Sure.
it's a little bit similar.
So I mentioned this might be a bit looser, and sure enough, I've forgotten to mention the data point for this. I'll move on to the next question and just jam it in there. It's relevant there anyway.
This is a segue. This is also about activism.
Exactly, fair enough. So the data point I had in mind was $30 trillion, which is the amount of assets that are currently or soon projected to be under ESG guidelines. These are environmental and social governance guidelines for investing money. And sure enough, that's a tremendous amount of money, $30 trillion. And in our discussion a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the ways that democracy has sort of posed structural impediments to solving climate change. Again, it's all in the book. Check it out. But we didn't get around to talking about capitalism and whether capitalism itself is a problem for solving climate change. And a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about how capitalism actually is the method through which climate change will be solved. There's a lot of big talk about ESG investing as eventually crowding out other types of investments. Fossil fuel investments will disappear as renewable energy investments and other kinds of climate-friendly investments take over. Among the investors themselves, a lot of this talk. And now, most recently, in the last couple of years, there's been a turn away from this, at least in the headlines, turning away from ESG investments, and a return to the profitability of fossil fuels. And where there are profits, there are investors, it turns out. So should we really be, before we had that sort of conversation about democracy and climate change, should we have just been talking about whether capitalism and climate change are a problem? I mean, can capitalism solve climate change?
It's useful to be reminded of the politics conversation, because on the democracy point, I took this sort of middle ground position, which was to say that not all democracies are as problematic as American democracy in this regard, and that in fact, globally, pretty much the only societies to achieve de facto uncoupling of growth and CO2 emissions so far are democracies, and it's pretty difficult, even in the American case, to think of any democracies which haven't achieved some degree of decoupling. Is that enough to get us to climate stabilization within the time frame that we need? Open question, we don't know. But we can't, on the experience to date, rule it out. And the Chinese regime is doing a huge amount of green investment, which I'm as enthusiastic about as anyone, but so far it hasn't delivered de facto decarbonization. Right? So that was the opening move on democracy. I'm tempted to make a similar kind of move on capitalism, as to say, there is a school that says that capitalism is inherently wedded to fossil fuel consumption. This will be the Andreas Malm kind of position, which essentially sees fossil fuels as integrally involved in the unlocking of the surplus value of labor, which is the core from a Marxist point of view of the analysis of capitalism. And so if those two are joined at the hip, then you can't have the generation of surplus value without the enabling power of fossil fuels being unlocked. I don't find that convincing as an argument. But by the same token, neither do I believe it's very convincing to imagine that capitalism by itself is likely to generate a path to decarbonization at all, let alone quickly enough, because my take on it would be that it's basically omnivorous. I mean, capitalism can make money out of any number of different types of transactions, and typically we see this in the ESG case. So the promise of ESG was that if you bundled enough really powerful investors together, the weight of their investment would be such that it would shift the balance of development. And I think it can, and I think it does, and I'll say a little bit about that in just a second, but the fundamental flaw in this thinking is that unless the activist investors do a deeply uneconomic thing, which is to simply shut down the assets which are polluting, if what they do instead is to sell the assets which are polluting, they're selling them on to another actor which will go on operating them. And more often than not, since the ESG-motivated actors are the ones that have signed up, tend to be the high-end balance sheets, they end up offloading the shitty assets onto weaker balance sheets, which are less able to conduct sensible rundown programs, less able to deal with disasters when they happen, less able to compensate for the environmental damage which they create. So in a sense, weaker, dirtier hands end up holding the bad assets, and ESG is more an exercise in window dressing in that sense than it is really in a comprehensive shutdown of fossil fuel consumption. Having said that, I don't think we should be altogether condemnatory, because I think in the one zone where decarbonisation actually so far has produced real results, which isn't in oil or something like that, because oil is a booming industry still, notably in this country. The one area where it's really happened is coal. And decarbonisation so far globally essentially consists of pushing coal out of the electricity supply system, electricity generation. And I don't think there's any question at all that though you can offload shitty coal assets to weak hands still, it's very difficult right now to raise funds for large-scale coal investment, new coal investment. The only place that's happening on a large scale still is China, if you look at the IEA data. And that, I think, to an extent, is, in some senses, can be credited partially, at least, to the ESG motive. Now, you're going to ask, what kind of motive is that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, is this purely motivated by calculations of profit and loss? And if that's the case, then that's not always the window dressing in which ESG was presented.
Well, I think the point then is that ESG is performing the function which in the end is the only one we can presumably rely on, which is that it is bringing investors to a position of enlightened self-interest. In other words, it is forcing them or encouraging them to think about the longer-term trade-offs, not to take shitty short-term deals which offer quick rewards now in exchange for longer-term risk. It's saying, look, we are going to be part of the change which over the period of the foreseeable future is going to make coal unacceptable, so be on the right side of history now. And that has a moral element to it, but it's ultimately a self-interested argument, which is to say, get on the right side of history because you're going to look bad if you're on the wrong side. Trouble is coming your way further down the line. And right now, there are a bunch of other invest options, which are in any case, given the huge progress on the renewable side, better bets. And so it's within the domain of self-interest and profit calculation, but that is wide open and quite complex and never really given simply as simple math. And so ESG serves the function of shifting that envelope away from coal.
And does that work? Do those long-term arguments work in a shareholder meeting? I mean, I always thought it's sort of like, what's the profits next quarter, next year?
Depends what you're doing. There may be people in the room who have experience of this and may want to come in on this conversation later on. But But if you're looking at large-scale energy investments, they're not quarter to quarter. You're having to make bets on the next 10 to 20 years.
Yep.
And that's a very different game. And in those calculations, it's quite reasonable to introduce longer-term guesses as to what the regulatory environment's going to be. And you can hedge that in various ways and go ahead anyway, but there's quite a lot of actors that just simply are saying, we don't want to be part of that risk. We think in any case, a combination of gas and solar and wind and batteries are going to do it for us, and that's where we really want to be. But I mean, look at the data centers now and the push to bring Harrisburg's reactors all back into operation. That's a gamble that says clean nuclear is going to be a good bet for an AI, for a data center going down the line. And that's not a short-term calculation. That's a very long-term calculation.
Some part of me wishes I could ask these questions of the 1980s Trotsky, Adam Tooze, but or wonder what he would say today
Trotsky,
about you now.
Typical Trotsky trajectory. This.
But I will shift to the next topic. John Maynard Keynes. Data point there, very simple. He would now be 141 years old. Obviously, has since deceased. I really had to cobble these data points in the very last second. I forgot to do them until we came out on stage. So, yeah, Keynes and Adam Tooze. A lot of parallels there. Both of you are British. Both of you are critics of simplistic microeconomics.
We're both tall. Yeah.
Both of you, I didn't know that about Keynes, but also I think an interesting parallel is that both of you, in a way, are types of aesthetes, right? I mean, if anyone who subscribed to Adam's newsletter notices he distributes a lot of very beautiful art in his newsletters. And John Maynard Keynes himself was not only an economist, but deep in the Bloomsbury intellectual and artistic scene in London in the early 20th century. And I'm curious whether his views on art affected his views on economics, and to what extent that was the case. And whether there are any parallels there with you. Do you think the art taste that you obviously spread has anything to do with your views on economics?
Bracketing the final part of the question. The question about Keynes is really very interesting, because it was a well-known an obsession with him, right? I mean, he was quite a serious art collector. He was well advised. He had both a Cézanne and a Sickert in his bedroom, apparently, by the 20s. So he was buying Impressionists in France around the turn of the century, advised by his Bloomsbury friends. Duncan Grant and others were advising him. He then married a ballerina and became deeply preoccupied with the funding and the future of ballet as a kind of total art with music and dance and scenery. He actually set up, he used his investing prowess to help set up something like a universal basic income for ballet dancers. So he wanted to create a fund that would ensure that the ballet creatives could actually survive. He was the mastermind behind the theatre complex, one has to call it, in Cambridge, which becomes one of the breeding grounds of theatrical talent in the UK in the aftermath of World War II. He's a member of the board of the National Gallery, and he starts to die, literally, in the spring of '46, while he's overseeing a performance attended by 3 generations of the royal family, and the stress got to him, and his heart condition really began to deteriorate very rapidly. He suffered a minor heart attack and never really recovered. So it was a profound commitment. And if you look at his early work, before he knew what he was going to be, when he was an apostle, this secret society of particularly intellectually ambitious Cambridge undergraduates, he wrote about a dozen essays on the theory of aesthetics, which were quite extraordinary. Formal exercises in aesthetics on the one hand, these very, very complicated analyses of aesthetics coming out of G.E. Moore, but then being Keynes, also an extraordinary essay about furniture and sex, and the question of whether or not you could really enjoy sodomy in a lady's boudoir, or whether or not the furniture would not have to be arranged differently for that kind of pleasure.
Yeah. This is Ones and Twos After Hours, by the way.
He was seriously, deeply engaged and interested in the way in which objects shaped experience. So if you've ever had the chance to go visit his rooms at King's, they're all decorated with these extraordinary Bloomsbury Group paintings, murals, which is like being in some sort of Neolithic cave setting. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And I think in the end, I don't think there's any doubt at all that it was fundamental to Keynes's view of the world also with regard to the economy, because his deepest... Right, Keynes has to be understood as a historical thinker, right? And his diagnosis of the problems of capitalism in the interwar period is a historical diagnosis. So the basic problem with regard to macroeconomics is the fact that the investment function has become unpredictable and unstable. And the shorthand for that is animal spirits. But the deeper historical interpretation behind that is that the framework of bourgeois society that orientated investment in a relatively predictable way and productive way in the period before 1914 has been torn asunder by World War I, and therefore you need the guiding hand of the economic technocrat to fill the space. And one step back from that, there's an even more capacious social theory that says that modernity consists in progressively the taking over of more and more space by the investing class, who are characterized in his mind by the fact that they're the lowest form of modern desire. It's desire that doesn't really know what it wants, is a Freudian reading of the pursuit of money. So scientists know that they want truth. Artists are the highest forms of human existence because their pursuit is beauty, which is at the center and at the apex of More's social theorizing, which remains with Keynes throughout his life. So starting out as a teenager, it remains always there. So the deepest social problem is that not only do we have a bourgeoisie that has lost its political and historical direction and compass, and therefore investment has become random, and therefore we need state policy to guide it, but the entire process of societal development has become enslaved to not Marxist theory of alienation and the factory as a source of alienation, but a more comprehensive alienation, which consists in the fact that decision-making is dominated by the fundamentally empty pursuit of money, which he describes as not knowing what you want. So if all you want is money, it basically means you don't know what you want. And so in Keynes's ultimate project is not just by means of macroeconomics to stabilize this unsteady bourgeois pursuit of profit, which general theory provides an analysis of in terms of the indeterminacy of the investment function, but ultimately to harness the macroeconomic policy to public aesthetic projects. And the highest art form for him, because it's most socially consequential, is architecture. And so when we talk about Keynesian work creation projects, like the cynical comment he makes is that, you could employ people burying and then digging up bottles full of money. But the true purpose of Keynesian macroeconomics ultimately would be to orientate not the economy, but social life generally towards the efficient, as far as his economists can help, production of an aesthetic realm in the public space. And so his economics is informed by a social theory that says that art has been displaced from the center and needs to be brought back, and then economics that says that the instability of the investment function is in itself a further degeneration of that bourgeois spirit, which no longer can even pursue economic growth in a stable way. And so the whole thing is encased actually in an aesthetic theory. His dream would be, and one of his criticisms of democracy in the interwar period is that it was the fascists and the Soviets that were doing all of the civilization building. He devoutly believed, I owe this in part to my brilliant student, Barnaby Rain, who's been reading this stuff very deeply. He actually bought the Webb's analysis of Stalinism as Soviet civilization. And what Stalinism demonstrated was a society in which, aspiring upper middle class, and there still were upper middle class young people in the Soviet system, would not aspire to get rich. They would aspire to be apparatchiks or cultural producers or scientists. And this, for Keynes, was obviously not fit for Britain. He didn't advocate Soviet socialism for Britain, but it, to him, revealed the emptiness of contemporary bourgeois society.
Got it. Yeah, there seems like... I'm sure all you did too. Take notes. No, I was going to ask, I mean, it seems like it's kind of like a missing political layer there, because it's like, basically, you're supposed to have, it's in some sense, like rule by artists, essentially. You're supposed to have the artists atop this system of power. But how do you get there if the system of power is determined by the money and the investments that you were also just describing? What is it, how, and then obviously, Hitler and Stalin were both frustrated artists themselves.
I mean, that's the pessimistic reading. I think his argument would be that the current system also constrains the range of creative talents which are exposed in people. And so what's really striking about so much of his public intellectual activity is that it really is in that old BBC style, the Reithian style, which assumes that modern media like radio or even newsreel or early television might actually be mechanisms for discovering and unleashing in a much wider group of society than currently feels able to participate either in a consumer or let alone in a creative way in artistic creation. And I'm not going to say that there isn't a problem of democracy in Keynes. There absolutely is a problem of democracy in Keynes, and there is a not at all disguised elitism in Keynes. Not for nothing, he thinks of himself as a bourgeois liberal whose big political problem is to organize relations and power relations with the big, powerful bloc of organized labor, which he on occasion will simply refer to as stupid or dumb or ill-informed or well-intentioned but misdirected. All of that kind of de haut en bas is very much part of his rhetoric. But I think in fairness, you have to say that along with a bunch of other activists, one might say, of the 1940s, he is probing the limits, a little bit like the WPA-type programs in the US, of where centers of artistic creation might actually be in a different society. So the fact that art has shriveled to being a matter essentially of the production of geniuses is an effect of the corrupted system that we live in. And the vision is not to take those geniuses and make them dictators, but to create a society in which artistic creation is much more generalized as a participatory process, both on the productive and on the receiving side. But I'm not going to, no, I mean, Keynes has a democracy problem for sure. I mean, that's an essential, or rather a democracy question. That's a fundamental problem for him.
I do want to bring Keynes to the present day right now, and namely, there's a lot of talk about us now being in an era of the end of neoliberalism, and maybe that the high point of this was the Biden administration's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave a speech at the Brookings Institute, declared an end to the era of unrestrained free trade, free markets, et cetera, that has sort of ostensibly reigned since for the last 40 years. Keynes himself was a critic of the kind of what we would describe as simplistic neoliberalism of this kind, and yet it doesn't seem like we're going back to a Keynesian framework either. I mean, are we sort of leaping ahead to a kind of post-Keynesianism? What would that even mean in that context? I mean, are we returning to a kind of older framework in this post-neoliberal moment, or are we moving past Keynes entirely?
Yeah. We should probably say beyond Keynes, because post-Keynesian, as some people in the room may know, is like a left-wing version of
Sure.
not new Keynesianism, because that's the people in MIT. Post-Keynesianism is this sort of 70s and 80s left Keynesianism. So we would be beyond it, I think.
Mm.
And you can, one of my shticks, and we've done it on the show, is that the Biden people seem almost afraid of their own Keynesian side, because after all, the giant stimulus of 2021, which has been hugely effective in macroeconomic terms, could claim a Keynesian heritage and a Keynesian inspiration. And yet I think they're almost embarrassed to talk about it because Larry Summers managed to tar it with a brush of inflation, and so now it's an embarrassment. But it's part of the Biden economics legacy. But I would agree that when we move down the industrial policy line, we seem to be moving away from what you might think of as classic Keynesian issues, except if you bring back that theme of investment and orientating investment that I was harping on just a minute ago. If you think of the fundamental Keynesian diagnosis as being not that we need to do fiscal policy when we're in a depression, but that the fundamental Keynesian premise would be capitalist economies, liberal capitalist economies are not self-stabilizing. Why are they not self-stabilizing? They're not self-stabilizing because investment has become erratic and is not heading in the right direction. If you think of that as the central question, then even the industrial policy of Biden economics can be brought back within a Keynesian frame. In other words, the question for them too is how do you direct investment in the right way? And the premise for the Biden folks as well is, going back to the ESG discussion, that if you leave private investors to their own devices, they're not going to get us to where we need to go, and so they need to be hustled and directed. And then if you reread Keynes, not so much the Keynes of the 30s with the general theory, but the Keynes of the 1920s, who is interested, not enamored of, unlike some people like Hoover, but interested in Italian fascism and its experiments in corporatism, which are public-private hybrid entities which are going to give investment a direction. There are quite strong historical analogies at that point, because then what we're talking about is new frameworks for thinking about the relationship between public direction and private initiative that would take the form of in the British case, they would be things like the BBC, which are semi-independent public bodies, for instance, or nationalized industries, which are also publicly overseen, but to a large degree autonomous actors within the state apparatus doing electricity, something like that, which will be a classic theme of the 20s and 30s as well. So to that extent, you could see it's really, you could say, history at work here, because it's not so much that we can now identify and arbitrate between what is Keynesian and what not, so much as the 21st century needs a new Keynes. We need to find new aspects of what that Keynesian legacy can be, and he's a rich enough thinker of an earlier moment of crisis for there to be these other strains in his thought which are now more actual, now more relevant than they might have been at earlier moments. This is not the Keynes of the emergency room, shock paddles to just revive the economy with a jolt. This is the Keynes who's thinking about long-run political economy and the relationship between the public and the private and the state and government and private investment.
Okay, so there's always a Keynes.
There's always a Keynes.
There's always a Keynes. No matter what moment you're in.
No, whatever mood you're in, whether you want to do it on the chair or the sofa, whether you're feeling, like you'd like a cushion.
There's a Keynes out there for you.
There's Keynes for every moment.
Good to know. I guess I'll jump ahead now to talking about the UN, and I should also say here that we do want also questions from the audience. That's always a part of these live events. So please do think of questions. We'll turn to them in just a bit after we talk about the UN. Again, apologies for the data point. Very last minute. 193 countries.
Oh no!
Yeah, exactly. You saw me in there.
That's shocking.
This is we were in. It was like 5 minutes before we came out. It's been a busy day. Leave me alone, Adam. Yeah, so the UN. Claudia, cut the data points out. Okay, so we obviously we think of the UN as the pinnacle of liberalism in some way, the pinnacle of cosmopolitanism. It's the kind of represents this philosophy of cosmopolitanism, of bringing the world together, of maybe even breaking down the boundaries to have a cooperative project in the world. I wanted to ask whether it also reveals the limits of cosmopolitanism. I was just reading this book by the very recently deceased literary critic Frederick Jameson. And the book is not yet out, I think. It's called The Years of Theory. I think it may be about to come out. I don't. And in it, he describes basically this tradition of progressive thought in France and how it paralleled events in post-war France, in which France was trying to position itself between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was almost part of a national project of progressivism. And as the Cold War ended and this idea of France standing apart dissolved, and we entered a period of cosmopolitanism, this tradition of progressive thought kind of dissolved with it, he says. And it got me thinking, like, whether we need the nation, in a way, to have this progressive thought. Like, whether, in a way, we've been had this period of neoliberalism that's paralleled our cosmopolitan moment with the UN as well, and whether that itself is a kind of, do we need the nation as a kind of vehicle for some of this progressive thought that we all so value?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't even quite know what to say. It's fitting to be thinking about Jameson right now. I couldn't get a hold of the book because it's not out yet, but your prompt sent me in the Pret-a-Manger in Edinburgh Airport this morning to a certain Russian website where I found a handy PDF of an American utopia. Jameson's 2016, explosive essay that then spawned a whole discussion on this theme, because he essayed there this extraordinary thesis that basically said, and I think it's important to frame it right, that given the chronic, persistent failure of the state to serve as a vehicle for radical politics, and given the exhaustion of all other alternatives, including, to his mind, the labor movement, but also all of the activist movements that we started by talking about, one should consider, in the US case, and it's quite a specifically US argument, the possibility that the only possible vehicle for dual power, in other words, a truly counteracting force, this is inspired by the Russian revolutionary moment of 1917. The only possible vector for a dual power counterforce in the US right now would be, wait for it, it's kind of this extraordinary idea, a national militia based on universal conscription. That was the Jameson project, right? This took the point you're making about France to this radical extreme of saying that in the end, it was only really the nation in uniform or in arms rallied around a national militia that in this moment could face up to the fundamental challenge that political theory had never, ever solved, to his mind, in the modern period, which was to deliver on the promise of the people. He cites this phrase from Deleuze, a people yet to be made, un peuple à venir, a people to come. And in a kind of convulsive last utopian or dystopian kind of vision, he imagines a people summoned into existence by means of a national militia. And I don't know about you, but at this particular moment in time, this really just sends me off into my Keynesian cringe, and I'm like, poor. I know you go to like Lytton Strachey is amazing. You know, when Lytton Strachey they tried to conscript him for World War I, and they said, well, sir, don't you feel you ought to defend civilization? And Strachey's immortal response was, but sir, you don't understand. I am the civilization that needs to be defended. I am the civilization, right? And if it were to be the case, let's grant for a second that the United Nations, in the pursuit of peace, let's just imagine it did effectively contain the urges of violence that come out of those national militarisms. If it did come at the price of demobilizing that national agent, would it not be a price worth paying? I mean, if it did actually have that effect, if we could credit the UN with actually demobilizing national power to the extent that it actually prevented war, I would at least say, that's a form of cosmopolitanism, perhaps depoliticized, that I would be willing to embrace as an alternative to the reality of nationally organized projects of militarism, which for most of the 20th century and in Jameson's final thinking apparently kind of reduced to almost ad absurdum, right? That logic driven to its ultimate point, if that's really the end of radical thought, then I'm tempted to retreat to a kind of liberal centrism that says we manage crisis instead, which is a stark alternative. But in any case, however, I think it's not tenable as an argument, right? Because the UN is not a world federation. The UN is, in fact, an assembly of nation states, designed as such from the very beginning by the most powerful nation state, the United States, the global hegemon indeed, in the form of a continental nation state, deadlocked ever since, essentially by the contest between the major nation states, and as we witnessed before our very eyes at this exact moment, completely unable to, in fact, contain nation-state power of the military kind. If the nation-state has been eroded, it's not the UN that's doing that, right? It's other forces.
Okay,
and to that extent, surely the more obvious worry is the UN just hasn't succeeded enough in eviscerating in that national state as a vector of radical political mobilization.
Okay, I guess on one hand, it's good to know you're not ready to lead a militia yourself. I mean, part of me was wondering whether that's where this would end up tonight. All of us marching out onto the streets. Never know after hours. But okay, so then you've, I think, really rightly set the limits on what the UN is and should be rightly described as. Then, though, where should we locate cosmopolitanism then? If we're looking for a kind of ideology that unifies the world, breaks down boundaries between countries, doesn't have a kind of hierarchical hegemon that's reigning over it, should we then really be concluding that this philosophy of cosmopolitanism really finds its expression in neoliberalism? I mean, like, neoliberalism is this philosophy of capitalism that also broke down boundaries between countries, also had a philosophy of cosmopolitanism of its own kind, and also, doesn't have a kind of hegemonic hierarchy in terms of nation states, certainly. So is neoliberalism the real cosmopolitanism? Is that what we should conclude?
I mean, isn't that why a lot of leftists cling to the FT, Bloomberg, and Economist as their main sources of information about the world?
Or Adam Tooze.
Isn't that why I write for the FT? Isn't that why?
Sure.
Is because the unacknowledged. I mean, I went to an extraordinary meeting at Johns Hopkins where this bunch of wonderful lefty colleagues of mine were all trading stories about how they'd all discovered Bloomberg Radio as a source of this, like, great, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, yeah. as a source of like extraordinarily interesting information about how capitalism works. Like, yeah, indeed, every single day, anytime you like, any hotel room you're ever in, it's all there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in the 80s, there was this really fascinating intersection between Marxism today of the moment, not the Trots Marxism, so the old CPGB and the FT. Like, it was actually, because they were both basically interested. Hobsbawm, Thompson, Perry Anderson, all of these people are devoted FT readers because they see in it capitalism's, Marx's steamroller, whatever it is, of modernity that's bulldozing down the boundaries of nationalism and creating. But I mean, is it egalitarian? Is it non-violent? Is it not hegemonic? Of course not. It's that plus violence and power and sometimes a degree of, like, often huge dollops of cynicism. On the one hand, cynicism, and on the other hand, hypocrisy. So yes, but that is the place where that is most effectively realized. And the challenge for radical politics that would not go down the Jameson route would presumably be to work through various other types of bottom-up lateral alliance, which is why the politics of migration is so fundamental, to my mind, to the current moment, right? Because that is that is the space within which a different type of cosmopolitanism is rehearsed and enacted and lived under totally different conditions from the from the world depicted in those Anglosphere media. And that's why I think that duality is, for many people thinking about these problems, so central, right? The problem of migration, it's not simply a matter of humanitarianism and the horror of what happens on the fortress boundaries of Europe and the United States. It's also analytically significant. It's diagnostic of a condition of de facto interconnection that is being subverted or interfered or blocked by national power, by various types of political interest, by the cynicism of right-wing political entrepreneurs, by local entrenched interests that want to prevent that kind of movement. But it's another, financial markets on the one side, and on the other hand, the price of people smuggling. These are like both. These are both indices of a kind of de facto cosmopolitanism that are very, very powerfully revealing of the condition that we live in.
Like I said, we would love to take questions. We're about to. So I don't know. Will we have a microphone? I think we did have a microphone that would rove around, right? Two. Where? Okay. Maybe we can have someone. Rob, do you want maybe? Yes. Okay. Cool. Yeah. I guess then it is interesting that there is that aesthetic interest in this kind of international financial capitalism, even though that those ideals are not embedded in the Financial Times necessarily. But this is not the capitalism's own ideals that are embedded there. I guess that the people that cosmopolitans are being fascinated by. It's not necessarily. Or maybe I've misunderstood that. It sort of is the producers of the Financial Times as well cosmopolitan in the same way that as the idealistic cosmopolitanism that we were just talking about.
I don't think it's by accident that both the FT and the Economist are like vigorously skeptical towards the new industrial policy, protectionism, the new nationalism in economic policy. But I think the more significant thing is simply the coverage of world events. That's the real marker of cosmopolitanism in the current moment, right? It's not your attitude, your embrace of a certain set of values. It's actually more fundamentally whether you're even just basically interested in what's happening in the world in a comprehensive sense, and whether or not you're willing to subject and subordinate your efforts to track what happens to some metric like, it's a huge continent with lots of people, we should know about it, right? And just calling these places, what was it,
Sure.
shithole countries,
Sure.
won't work.
Yeah.
And that Indonesia is not, as I've heard from people literally in the NSC, countries like Indonesia. Like, there is no other country like Indonesia. It's really radically sui generis. If you've ever spent any time thinking about Indonesia, the first thing that strikes you is, oh my God, this place is different from anywhere else in the world. And so it's incumbent on you to actually understand its specificity, right? But not, and so that kind of logic is in the end, what makes Reuters, for instance, still an incredibly useful news source as well, I think, because just the comprehensive coverage. We've got a Reuters
we have a
colleague
Reuters
here.
person
No,
here,
it really is. It's amazing. Does a fantastic job. Bloomberg ditto. You know, there's that sense of a determination not just to allow ourselves to be sucked into an orbit that says that the world consists of the United States, the Middle East, and China, or Taiwan.
Yeah. I know there are questions. Raise your hand, and we have a microphone going around.
We've got one at
we
the
will.
front here.
All right. We have someone up here. Oh, well, we have Claudia
This
going
guy
back
I
there.
owe a pen to as well. I got to get a pen back to you.
Keynes. I remember about 100 years ago, Keynes said that the economic problem, as he put it, would be solved about in 100 years, which is to say roughly now, by which he meant, of course, that there'd be plenty of money in the West and we're done.
Yeah.
I'd never known what you mentioned, this fascinating Freudian idea that Keynes had of the investor class becoming kind of compulsive and irrational about the pursuit of money.
Yeah.
I suddenly thought, oh, I get it. Why the economic problem is not considered anywhere near solved in the West, apart from unfair distribution, inequality, and all that, is because of this ongoing pathological, obsessive desire for more and more and more and more money that is spread beyond the investor class to ordinary people in, say, the United States. Is that true?
I don't know whether it's true, but I think it's a fair reading of Keynes. I think that's exactly where he would have ended up. I think from the perspective he was writing, this is Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which is 1930, 31, 32, something like that, which is a eyes above the parapet, folks. Things are shit right now. We're in the Great Depression, but remember how far we've come since the 19th century. If you just broadly project this out over 100 years, things will be so extraordinarily affluent, people will be so well off that all economic problems will be solved. And I'm sure he would look at our current reality and say, they are. No, the only reason that we have child poverty in the United States is because we choose to have child poverty in the United States. We know exactly what's necessary to end it. We don't do it. We're making a choice. So there's not an economic problem there. It's not even a political problem. It's literally the consequence of a political choice. So I think he would consider himself vindicated. You could even say that he's vindicated at the global level by exactly the same argument, right? The global GDP per capita right now is enough to provide everyone on the planet with all of the necessary means for a good life. And the fact that we are not in that position is the result of a failure of what he, in his sort of typically slightly twee English terms, would have said, a muddle. It's a muddle, right? And because would we be better off collectively, almost certainly through a larger measure of redistribution, and would the opportunities that are opened up by that not then feed and produce ever more innovation? They almost certainly would. And so really that act of redistribution in the first instance is so generative of a better society, of a better for everyone, that that our failure to make that leap is a sign of a muddle rather than simply a conflict of interest, because we're not understanding clearly what our better and higher interests would be. But to just wrap this, implicit in this story is that Keynes, like most folks before the kind of perpetual growthmanship logic kicks in, which is really a post-45 syndrome, Keynes is somebody who's quite comfortable with steady state thinking. In other words, he's open to degrowth or to post-growth. because even the framework of his economics, I mean, he's a man who's preoccupied with Malthus and with demography. There's a eugenicist in there as well. Very typical intellectual formations of the interwar period. And they don't yet see, which is why Stalinism fascinates them so much, they've not seen sustained decade after decade after decade, 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 10%, as in China, growth rates before. It's just never happened, right? The society to grow most rapidly ever up to that point is the US, which has sustained a nice ticking along 2 to 3% per annum over decades, and that's totally transformative. The British Industrial Revolution, cashed out in per capita terms in its early phases, is barely half a percentage point a year, and the fact that it's sustained over a century plus is what makes the difference. Because prior to that, economic history had been cyclical. Malthus wasn't entirely barking up the wrong tree. He had a kind of good idea. So all of this is a very long-winded way of saying that, yes, I think your interpretation is really, I think, perfectly, as a shorthand, I think you're spot on. And the Freudian, the reading of the emptiness is ultimately rooted in the fact that at some point Keynes is somebody who thinks about the steady state as the norm. That's where we're going to end up. And his promise and his optimism is that we will stabilize at a very high level, a historically unprecedented level. And, you know, as a devout adherent of the EU, with all its warts and alls, you could say the EU is, you know, pretty damn close to realizing exactly that. You know, a very, very low growth at a very high level of affluence. Japan, similarly, right?
I should clarify, questions do not need to be about Keynes. They can be about anything. Yeah.
Two at the front. Why don't we do two?
Yeah, sure.
Two bundles.
Why we can do two together? Yeah. Why don't you ask and then we ask them. We'll get them together.
All right. Okay. So you briefly brushed upon the problem with Keynes and democracy, and that reminded me of a certain German leader and his opinions on the fiscal power of the state.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah. Sure.
And then let's get another question.
Yeah.
I think that was a
The
reference.
certain German leader was Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler.
Yeah.
That's, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, who's leading Germany?
Yeah.
He ended up with a German passport. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, maybe this will pair well. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the debate recently about Cold War liberalism. Moyne had that book a couple years ago, which I thought was good, but it got criticized pretty heavily by, I think, David Bell and then also John Gans, and obviously Jan Werner Mueller was writing about Cold War liberalism and goes back to Sklar, who Moyne names as a Cold War liberal in her maturity. So, just curious about that. Maybe go with the Keynes stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Great questions. So
Yeah,
I'll
so that
answer
second-
these two, and then maybe we'll look for post-Keynes questions after. So the embarrassment is that German was the first language the general theory was translated into in 1936. And Keynes, being a little bit of a, what should we say, he really liked attention. Like he really, really liked attention. Wrote a gushing preface to the German edition saying, well, you know what? It might very well be that my theory of aggregate demand would be best applied in a state of dictatorship.
He sucked up to Hitler, really.
He said that. He said that in the preface. And I mean, important to say, like Keynes was an anti-fascist. He is the key organizer of the British war effort and the major thinker of the North Atlantic war effort in World War II. This man did as much to defeat Nazism as practically anyone, right? So this is not a matter of personal sympathy. It's better read, I think, as a case of like accidental and rather revealing intellectual honesty, which is that as conservative liberals, coming on to speak about them, pointed out, and what terrified them about Keynesian economics is that ultimately the content of the policy, when you think of it only as macroeconomics, is empty. In other words, it is literally true that you could stimulate the economy by filling bottles with pound notes, burying them, and then paying other people to dig them back up again, and you would get the aggregate demand effect. Now, no one in their right mind would advocate that, and Keynes didn't. What he advocated was this aestheticized welfare state vision. But he was honest enough to admit that if you came along and said, you know what I'd really like to do with this is transfer 20% of GDP from the civilian to the military sector, that would also produce a stimulative effect in the short run if you start in unemployment. And there is nothing in his theory which debars you from making that move. And what you've done is you've spelled out the analytical scheme with which you could optimize that policy, which is why Hayek will say, and that's precisely why your thinking is dangerous. Right? That's why it's dangerous. It's not because it's wrong analytically. In a state of unemployment, it makes sense. It just opens the door to this activism. All of our terms are really acting out. It just opens the door.
Full circle.
It opens the door to this activism, and the activism, and this is the thing about activism, right? As an impulse per se, it has a kind of slightly Freudian feel. It's do something, anything, do it now, right? Because you want to be doing something. In the German case, they want to be freeing themselves from the imagined servitude of the world Jewish conspiracy, et cetera, right? And that's what's so dangerous about this kind of thought, and this rumbles all the way down. I did a chart book about the way, and there's a certain sort of Keynesian who can't live with the consequences of this, and Keynes himself was not one of them. But when American liberals, for instance, turned all conservative over the financing of America's wars of choice and the global war on terror in the 2000s, and somebody like Joe Stiglitz is pillorying this as something America can't afford, it's like, hey, folks, come on. We know you can afford it. The question is, do you want to do it? Right? If you've chosen to do it, America can definitely afford it, right? So don't come with this whole pre-Keynesian logic at the moment when the going gets rough. You can't argue the case that way. And Keynes is honest enough to say, during World War II, when he's presented with one of the German currency plans, and he's asked to write a rebuttal, he simply says, I can't, I won't, there's no point. We should do exactly the same thing. So it doesn't work. And this is one of the most puzzling things about Moyne's book is that he professes to be talking about liberals that matter in the later half of the 20th century, and he doesn't talk about the liberals that matter in the later half of the 20th century, because he talks about all of these obscure, essentially neoconservative or conservative thinkers that pass for liberal in the American Cold War context, but just didn't matter ever, right? It's really... And he doesn't talk about Keynes. He doesn't talk about American Keynesians. He doesn't talk about a figure like Galbraith, for instance, who would be an obvious person to talk about in this context. And so it's, I think, it's a slightly straw-man-y book in which you discover that a bunch of people who were profoundly conservative and anti-Keynesian, guess what, had rather restrictive views about the function of government in the Cold War period. For fear of, well, then the question is for fear of what? For fear of tyranny, apparently, right? And so that then becomes the central preoccupation. I think there's another question which is underexplored. So Sam Moyne wrote this. It was a series of lectures he gave at Oxford, and it's a series of more or less controversial case studies of Arendt, Himmelfarb, Sklar, canonical figures of the American Cold War era. And what is exposed in each case is that the point I really like that he makes in the book is that their liberalism is a liberalism that evades the question of the philosophy of history, that is unwilling to think about the bigger questions of progress, for fear that in doing so you end up in the Keynesian space where you're going to enable somebody who's going to make history by violence, right? What I think Moyne evades, which in the current moment is the question which completely obsesses me, is whether or not the liberals of the 50s and 60s are worried about talking about history because they're afraid it's going to unleash violence, or whether they're worried about talking about history because they don't know whether history is on their side. And in the current moment, that preoccupies me because China and climate, right? Because liberals define climate as our problem to fix in the West, and we were going to joust with the evil forces of Exxon and win the struggle and save the planet. And now it turns out it's not our planet to save. It's somebody else's, some other regime that will do either the destroying or the saving. And that is something that I think is even more destabilizing than the prospect that an authoritarian regime might make history in a violent way. It might not just make history in a violent way, it might make history in a violent way that is more consequential than our violent way of making history. Right? The T-34 is the Soviet tank that did more than any other instrument of Soviet industrialization to win World War II, is the emblem of this, to my mind. That the efficacy of an authoritarian and illiberal politics, not its violence per se, but the fact it may actually be history-making, so therefore taking history away from us, that I think may be an even deeper fit. And it's not one that Moyne tangles with, because he simply says to liberals, do history. He doesn't tell us what kind of historical narrative you'd end up with if you did.
Yeah, maybe those thinkers were right to be anxious, I guess is the point in that way. Maybe for the...
There's different reasons.
Yeah,
though.
for different reasons.
Yeah.
I'm going to, at this point, demand that the questions be not relate to Keynes. Yes, over here we have a question. Maybe we can even take a couple, again, that would be good. So please, let's start with you.
So I'll ask one.
Oh, wait, I think Claudia has yeah, we'll do those two together.
These are two.
Yes,
This is great.
perfect.
I wanted to ask about decarbonization, and I wanted to ask, where do you think corporate decarbonization fits into this discussion, or is it out of place? And is it or can it be aligned with everything we've been talking about? If you could elaborate on it.
And then we had
yes,
a question
please.
at the front here.
Mine's kind of related, so it's perfect.
all right.
But so I was going to ask a little bit about Milton Friedman and corporate social responsibility in the view of ESG. So I think of corporate social responsibility as maybe a place where we could solve the climate crisis, right? And a place where you could act short term if decarbonization requires short term actions. ESG is more long term. So that $30 trillion number that you called out, is that a failure of capitalism or actually a win for capitalism?
Yeah. These are really, really interesting questions. We should come back to this.
That's why I got a pen right here. I'll write that down.
So, I mean, Friedman's, you sound like you know your Friedman on this stuff, so correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding was that Friedman's position was that businesses should do what businesses do, which is follow the interests of shareholders and should not be messing around with the political agendas that are out there in society. And there's a bit of me that's actually profoundly sympathetic to that position. And this is quite typical kind of, opposites track, the state joins at the end, because I don't think we should rely on the good intentions of managers and business people and shareholders either. This is where I think the role for politics is clearly situated. In other words, it's up to politics and society to make clear to narrowly self-interested private actors what is permissible and what not, and what will gain market share and what won't, and then allow them to act out on that basis, as it were, their own self-interest, which will be guided by the regulatory framework and by the system of values in broader society, which will constrain where and how they can brand themselves and where and how they can make money by selling more or less odious products, right? So that, I think, would be, for me, the kind of typical, the simplest division of labor. It won't work quite as simply as that, because there will be capture of public institutions by self-interested actors who will think outside the box and go to the public institutions and manipulate them. And on the other hand, we're also not doing justice to large, sophisticated corporations, not, tiny outfits of private equity with 100 people in them, but big corporations, if we treat them simply as acting on the behest of their shareholders. They are large social organizations. Anyone who knows anyone who works in one will tell you they have deep cultures inside. They have to motivate entire generations of staff and leadership. So they need values, not just shareholder interest. And so on both sides, there is an interesting zone of politics to be played out, which is the question, the meta question of exactly how cynical is the lobbying of the business interests and how far do we allow that to become as cynical and hard-nosed as it could be. So we may need sequential orders of political control and more and more intensive activism that works on businesses as organizations and as social mechanisms so as to limit the degree to which they engage in the most cynical kinds of lobbying. See what I mean? So we start from the simple public authority dictates, private interests follow their private interests, and then move into this space in which, in fact, both sides are having to negotiate. And a further element comes when we think not just about this problem in the abstract, but we think about how we're actually going to do decarbonization. And then this goes to the first question that was asked. Then it seems to me that the case for suspicious, arm's length, politically monitored corporatism or public-private partnership is almost impossible to argue with. And that is around technological development, capacity building at the physical plant level. In other words, who is going to learn to make the PV panels as cheap as we need them? It isn't going to be a public bureaucracy, most likely. It's most likely going to be very highly competitive, highly incentivized private producers, which, as the Chinese have demonstrated, can be incentivized by government, but will run very, very effectively if they're actually pitted against each other. So that's one dimension. And the other one, probably, whether we like it or not, is on the funding side. It is true, as Keynes said, that we can afford anything we can do, but the politics of how we afford it is non-trivial. And if we have got a bunch of constraints on the public balance sheet that we can question, and I'm in favor of questioning those all the time, but if we reach the point where we've reached the limit of what we can do, then offloading a bunch of the capital raise that's necessary to private balance sheets is an obvious thing to do. I think there's a third element which goes to the corporations as societal actors, which is that they're good at branding, they're good at marketing, they're good at figuring out how you make XYZ sexy and commercial and saleable. And that may also be a role in which they, at the level of, as it were, the implementation of decarbonization, they play a key role. Tesla, in the end, God help us, he made electric cars sexy. He was the first person to figure out they could be sexy. We all obviously have our views about him, but that is a move that came from that side. And that has changed the world in a very, very important way. Then you need the Chinese subsidies. You needed Obama-era subsidies to unleash that entrepreneurial ego on that problem. But this kind of combination would be how I think we could think about these two questions.
I think we could take a couple more.
Also want to mention that we have other podcast capings for foreign policy tomorrow at the UN General Assembly. Sign up at foreignpolicy.com. Yeah, right. And we'll go to the last few questions.
Yeah.
I'll give short answers. It's down to me.
Yeah. Then in the back, I'm going to need you guys to help out to pick a couple. I find it interesting that the two names we evaded saying tonight were Hitler and Elon Musk. It was like...
But we did.
Yeah, you managed to say he and him without actually saying his name. Or were you talking about Hitler? I don't know.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. So you said that the UN is currently unable to prevent militarism in a lot of key states. And I was just wondering, do you think the UN will ever be able to prevent militarism of a Security Council state or one of its key allies? Or is this kind of an inbuilt failure that's just never going to be able to be fixed?
Great question.
Another
question to you. Could you tie in like discussion last week about Draghi and like the discussion today with the democracy deficit, and then in the EU, and then also like with Germany closing borders, like after the Turingen elections and the Schulz-Null?
I didn't.
Draghi, I gathered.
Yeah. Could you briefly
talk about
say that question again?
Like funding, like EU funding, and like unifying that and tying that into like EU closing its borders, like after or internal borders after the Thuringen elections of Germany.
Okay. Yeah.
And one
more.
more we'll take.
There's a woman at the back in the corner. Or
Yes.
another one. Two. Excellent.
My question is about art.
Yep.
What societies have you seen around the world where people in general engage with art as a daily part of their lives?
That is such a great question.
So we should repeat these three questions. Three very different questions.
Yeah, so there's one about art and its actual historic potential for affecting people's daily lives. There's a question about the UN and whether or not it could conceivably act as a peacemaking body. And then there's what's going on in Europe, the Draghi report, and the migration crisis. Totally justified kind of what is going on in Europe. So I'm going to bend the question back about art, not to like we should let's do an episode about that. The point I want to make here, and it's a Keynesy point, sorry, but the historic reference point, believe it or not, and this may strike folks as sort of flat out crazy, but there's no question that in his mind, the Soviet system with its publicly funded provision of art, and you're going to all laugh, but it's like this in his mind is the epitome of a regime that has broken with private profit. Because for Keynes, the worst thing was the private art market. That for him was because that was the subversion of the art system, the highest value by the lowest value. And so the public provision of funding and therefore the accessibility to workers, it's a candy floss version of Soviet civilization, but for contemporaries, this was a huge selling point of those civilizations. And it's not just propaganda. We know for a fact, there was a reality to the publicly funded art system in those societies that was different from anything prevailing in the West. And one of the glories of Keynes as an actor within the British welfare system is that for a period at least, after 45, the British state became a major sponsor. The most prominent thing that folks here will know is the art college scene, which produces so much of the art rock, programmatic rock in the British case, the British modernism and so on, which is publicly funded art education. So but it's a very provisional answer, and we should do a more comprehensive. The question of the UN and whether it ever really has would be answered early on in the history of the UN by the exceptional case where Israel made the mistake of ganging up with two truly renegade late imperialist powers, which will be Britain and France, in the, to this day, still staggering moment in '56, where the British and the French invade Egypt. I mean, it's just flat out insane. If you've seen the newsreel from the time, the British send a D-Day style fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean. They drop parachutists into Egypt and fight a war against the Egyptian state for Suez. And at that moment, it was possible for the UN to intervene because both the Soviet Union and Eisenhower in the United States could agree that this had to stop. And so at that point, the UN actually becomes, and there's an extraordinary speeches by Eisenhower, who incidentally is also the inspiration for Jameson, because Eisenhower says if you want public health, the thing to do is join the American army. And that triggers Jameson, the UN, those are the moments when it can act. So there are the particular moments, but they have existed, and that will be the configuration. Israel did better out of it than either Britain and France in '56. On Europe, just to wrap, because I know we're at time, the Draghi report is a really remarkable moment in European history because what it literally says into a conversation in America, which is bewailing the failure of industrial policy in the US, and the fact that America gave up all of its competitive advantage. Here are a bunch of extremely well-informed Europeans looking at in the US and going, who are you kidding? Like, for the last decades, you've been pursuing a more or less overt, quite aggressive, highly effective state capitalist combine that consists of Pentagon spending, the suspension of antitrust, huge profit earning in the private sector, enormously dramatic investment, and the willingness to sacrifice existing industrial structures for the birth of the Mag 7. And what on earth are you talking about? Because with that, you've entirely changed the conditions for us. And you were crying over the spilt milk of American industrialism and the fact that China ate your lunch in steel. And we're looking at you and going, we wish we had your problems, because you have created a powerhouse, capitalist, state capitalist combine. Where's ours, and how do we get there? And this, to me, is Draghi's great second act, because as the Goldman Sachs dude that he was, as the man of the markets during the Eurozone crisis, he essentially says the same thing. Enough already with not understanding with how this works. The way this works is the central bank does whatever it takes to stabilize the financial system. And is that, good, well, easily framed within ordo-liberal rules? No, it's not. It's an ad hoc, adventurist, it's activist. Whatever it takes is pure activism. It literally says, whatever action you need, I'll do it. And what Draghi is saying now is, we're going to have to bite the bullet if folks don't pay enough for their cell phones in Europe, for the cell phone companies to earn enough as quasi-monopolies to invest heavily in 5G, we're going to become roadkill. And so it's an incredibly explicit articulation of the trade-offs in political economy right now, and in a sense, a much better guide to America's history than what you get within the Beltway in the current moment, which is a sort of larmoyant, crocodile tears being shed for the American working class that was quite consciously sacrificed on the altar of investor-driven globalization in the 90s and the early 2000s.
I think we're going to have to call it a show at this point. We are just a little bit over time, but thank you again. Thank you all for coming out. These are always so much fun. We are always happy to see everyone. Thank you to Foreign Policy for helping make this happen. Thank you to Caveat for hosting us. Yeah, we're going to be hanging around for a little bit. Can sign some books. Adam's books are also available over here, so check that out. And yeah, first Ones and Twos After Hours. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for coming out.
Jet lag.